Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Carrie McKinnon of the Goleta and San Ynez Valley Libraries. Today's program is coming to you from the Solvang Library and it's part of our third annual Book to Action program, which is a community reading program. In this year, it centers around themes of diversity and inclusion found in the stunning graphic novel memoir, They Called Us Enemy by George Takei. It's shared in the format of a graphic memoir, and it is his firsthand account of his childhood experience as a Japanese American who was forced from his home into an internment camp during World War II. We want to thank the California Center for the Book for organizing many such community reading programs at libraries throughout California. And we'd also like to thank the Friends of the Library of San Ynez Valley and the Friends of the Goleta Valley for assistance with funding the program. So today's speaker is part of our reaching out and exploring the different subjects that have to do with not just the Japanese American internment, but there were Germans, Italians, and others that were interned during World War II. And some of their stories are not well known at all. So we're very excited to have today's speaker. She is the second of 5 planned over the next few months. Dr. Sigrid Toye is an educational and behavioral therapist in private practice. She holds a PhD in clinical psychology. She currently writes for Voice magazine, the Montecito Journal, and volunteers in Santa Barbara. Sigrid loves all things creative, including her 2 grown children who are both working artists. And welcome, Sigrid. Hello.
Hi, how are you? Hi, Carrie. Hi, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Sigrid.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's such a pleasure and privilege and honor. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'm excited because Sigrid is going to tell us the story of her family and especially her father, Eugene Banzhaf, who was an anti-Nazi German who was nevertheless incarcerated in the United States during World War II, along with, as I mentioned, others of Italian and Japanese American descent. So the first thing we're going to do before we start talking and hearing the story is we have a beautiful little short film that Sigrid and her son have made. And it is the story of Sigrid's first experience, I think. What your first memory?
My first memory. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. Let me take a couple of these things off.
Mama? 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 Mama, what's wrong? Do you hear me, Mama? Why are you crying, Mama? Why is it so dark? Could you please stop that sound?
I wish I could, my child. I wish I could.
Is it a fire engine, Mama?
No, Magdalene. There is no fire. It is an air raid siren. We have to keep all the lights out and wait for the danger to pass.
Don't worry, Mama. We'll be all right. Don't cry. Daddy will protect us. Won't he? Where's Daddy? Mama, where's Daddy?
Daddy's not here now. There was some men that came to the door. They asked him to go along with them.
Why? Did he want to go?
They came into the house, looked for a time. They just didn't tell us anything.
Why didn't he say goodbye to me?
Daddy wanted to say goodbye. But he couldn't. You were upstairs in the bed. And they would not allow him to go up the stairs. He told me to give you a saline for him.
Mama, the siren stopped. What does that mean? Are you gonna be okay?
For my question, there was no answer on that fateful night in December of 1941 as my mother and I sat together in silence. Like the black and white demarcation line on the street lamp outside our house, war had separated our little family. The air raid siren was a further reminder of the dark days ahead. On that night, along with many Japanese Americans, my father and other German, Italian, and European Americans were apprehended from their homes by the FBI and relegated to internment camps throughout the United States. Designated as enemy aliens, they were not provided with an explanation for their arrest, legal representation, or the benefit of a trial, as their rights of habeas corpus had been removed. Prisoners and their families attempted to find a semblance of life within the confines of the guard towers, not knowing what their future would hold. 3 years would pass before my father, declared completely innocent, would be returned to us. Life was not easy for my mother, as food was scarce and employment virtually impossible, for suspicion abounded that a woman with an accent might be a saboteur. The isolation she felt destroyed her already delicate emotional health. During those lost years and for many years after, I hid in the shadow of silence. With the passing of time, I came to know that war knows no national, ethnic, or religious boundaries, nor is subject to the passing of time. Only one common thread exists: war's impact on the innocent. We, who are the children of war, remember.
Wow. That's very powerful. Beautiful.
And how about that adorable kid that played me? That's a long story, but we had it planned otherwise, but something got in the way, and that adorable child who played me is now a college, finishing her freshman year in college. Time
Wow.
passes.
Is she pursuing a theater or a acting career?
No,
No.
no, she's not. She's pursuing the biosciences.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Wow.
But we pressed her into service. She did a great job.
She did. She
Yeah.
did. I didn't realize. Wow, last minute. That was fantastic. And what a powerful memory and the beginning of your experience of this whole story.
Well, it was. It was indeed. And the reason I remember it was because at that point I really realized our lives had changed. Something had happened and everything had changed. And that really is the overriding thought that I had at that period of time. But there's, a whole backstory to that affected our family. And if I could talk a little bit about that, it might give that a little bit more meaning.
We would love it. And I think you have shared some slides, so let me put them up and we can start with that. Here we go. I love this photo.
I love this picture of my parents. It was on their wedding day in New York City. My father was sent by his company to be a representative. It's now, of course, in those days, he was the only representative. In 1927, when he first came over, and today, of course, it's Tyson Steel, and they have representatives. It's a multinational, and they have representatives in hundreds of countries and hundreds of people. But back in the day, in 1927, that was quite a big thing, and he was so excited. I do remember in some of his books when he was only 15 or 16, he was always reading about cowboys and Indians. So I knew he definitely wanted to come over here. And he and my mom knew each other in Germany, and he sent for her, and they were married in New York City in 1929, the day she arrived. So I love this picture of my parents because it's just, my mother's such an innocent young person, her beautiful eyes, and my father was blue-eyed and handsome.
Wonderful.
And they lived in New York for a while, and the company sent him across the country. They were in New York for a while. They crossed the country. And of course, in those days, America was just everyone's dream, the land of effectively milk and honey. The streets were golden. Everything was possible. And as a young couple, that's how they felt, even though, again, he represented the steel company. And as a result of his work, at least before the war and after also, that his sheet piling, his steel, is still in New York, Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles harbors. So he had a thriving business and felt so fortunate with my mother to have these opportunities. And so they came across the country, and this is an old picture I found of them. And they finally settled in Los Angeles, and I was born in Los Angeles in 1937, and my parents had just taken out their papers to become United States citizens. And their voyages, however, between 1941, which is this date, was the only thing I could really find that would describe when they came out to Los Angeles. excuse me, my father continued on with his business, and he would travel overseas to the company so he could view the new materials and everything every couple of 3 years, maybe. And the most important trip for my story about my father is the trip he took in 1939. My mother said, please don't go, let's not go. And my father said, my mother wants to see her grandchild. And he had by then realized how much the country had changed. And I don't think he felt comfortable about that either. But my grandmother, I should have posted a picture of my grandmother. Y'all would have been scared just looking at her. So, no, seriously. Oh, it was frightening. So they actually got on the boat and went overseas. And of course, their worst nightmare occurred. And war was declared. The European war was declared while they were there. And my father and mother were very frightened. And they had a friend who was able to obtain passage for all of us, for my parents and myself, and I was under 2 or just over 2, to board an Italian liner that was bound for New York. And the liner was a partial cargo ship, partial passenger ship. It left from, I believe it was Naples, and it was full of dissenters. There were people fleeing from Nazi Germany, and there were artists, there were political dissidents, there were Jews, there were homosexuals, there were intellectuals, everything that the last minute left. And my father and my mother were so lucky to get passage on that ship. However, once the ship entered international waters in the Mediterranean, the French boarded the ship and removed all of the Germans from the ship, most of whom were Germans. And they sent the German men to North Africa, to a prison in Algiers called Bogar. And the German women and children were sent back to Germany. And, you know, I've often thought how dreadful that must have been, what they must have had to face with their families and with their husbands gone, how awful it must have been for them in Germany. However, in my case, since I was an American-born citizen and my mother was my single caregiver, she was allowed to return to New York, and without my father. And at this juncture, I have to say how grateful, in behalf of my parents, and of course now myself, it was our American friends who were the ones that helped my father and my mother through these very difficult years. When we returned, we moved to Washington, D.C., where my godparents, my godfather, arranged for my mother to see Senator Alvin Barkley. And after several months, I think my father was in Bogar. I'm not quite sure how many months he was there. I don't have the paperwork in front of me, but he was there at least a half a year. He was returned to the United States, courtesy of the United States government, through diplomatic channels, and he arrived at home. And so, needless to say, not only am I grateful for the people who helped us, I'm also grateful to the American government to make that happen. And that was not long before the night of December 7th, when that film took place. That was my first memory of that film. So,
you told me,
Hmm?
you told me this beautiful drawing was made by an artist
Oh,
who was
thank you
also
very much.
incarcerated, also in the camp.
Thank you very much for reminding me. Yes, one of the artists, there were artists also, I don't know that I mentioned that, there were artists also on board the ship, and one of the artists drew, this is a drawing of my father in Bogar. Bogar was not a pleasant place. It was under the auspices of the French Foreign Legion, which effectively at the time were a group of mercenaries, and they guarded the French protectorates and their, you know, their colonies, of which Algiers was one at the time. And so this picture is particularly moving to me, and I'm grateful that you were able to put it up, because my father's eyes were so sad. And I think that he was representative, although much luckier than most, to be extricated. But I can't imagine what it must have been like to sleep in breads of straw with rats and vermins and go out in the heat of the desert and work. It was a labor camp. And unfortunately, most of the German men were in his barrack, as far as I know, with whom he stayed in contact. And when he was extricated, he stayed in communication with the families of his fellow detainees or concentration camp barrack comrades, with the families, and let them know about the families, how their husbands and fathers were. And those gentlemen eventually were returned. Some of them were able to escape, but most were returned to Nazi Germany. And it just stunned him and stuns me to this day, what must have happened to them. So in a way, my father was very fortunate to be able to be extricated from Algiers and French protectorate.
I think so. Wow. Okay. So
coming back from that, it was not long after, I believe he came back in May. I'm very unclear about that. He came back in May, and on the night of December 7th, he was, it's like an old Elliot Ness movie. Two gentlemen came to the door in fedoras and a dark car and dark suits, and came to the house and went through the drawers and everything, checked the place out, and took my father away. No one was told where he was to be taken. My mother, as depicted in the film, was completely confused, and she was very dependent on her husband. So we didn't know where he was until this telegram arrived. And we discovered that he had been taken to Terminal Island Correctional, in other words, jail, and they had renovated, not renovated is the wrong word, but they prepared a wing for the detainees of that night. And in order to best explain what happened, I think what's in the common or in the collective consciousness is the relocation and arrest of 120,000 Japanese persons, or persons of Japanese descent, Italian and some Germans as well, from the west coast of the United States. That is the phenomenon that is most well known. However, there was an entirely separate phenomenon that occurred on the night of December 7th. And that was as a result of 3 presidential proclamations that were called 25-25 for the Japanese descent, 26-27, 25-26 for German descent, and 25-27 for those of Italian descent. And the purpose of this these presidential proclamations was, the only way I can describe it, or as I understand it, and I may be incorrect, but it was kind of in a way to cut off the head of the snake, because the persons that were picked up on that night were businessmen, such as my father, Buddhist priests, community leaders, academics, anyone who was involved, or what they felt might be a community leader of influence in their individual communities. So again, these are very different phenomenons. The first one came immediately after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. And 2.5 months, February 19th, Executive 9060, which removed all of the Japanese, also an Italian. By the way, Joe DiMaggio, that's a super interesting story. Folk fishermen in Mexico, they were forced to sell their business and move offshore. And when Joe DiMaggio came to visit, he had to go ashore. Meanwhile, from the ballpark, it was America's greatest ballpark, and everybody admired him, but his folks had to have been moved offshore, and that's where he came to visit them. So that's an example of an Italian, a person of Italian, whose parents were moved from the West Coast. Actually, if J. Edgar Hoover had had his way, he would have had every coast in the United States have those folks moved away, German, Japanese, Italian descendants. But it would have shut down the economy, so they decided just to stick with the West Coast. So anyway, back to my dad. This telegram came to my mother within, I don't know, a couple of weeks. And he said, oh my goodness, the telegram says, I think I'm going to be sent to North Dakota. Oh, please put down a warm coat because it's really cold in the rain. And however, for some reason or another, fortunate enough to meet some of the folks who were in Fort Lincoln, and they were right. It was cold up there. So my dad then moved to Tuna Canyon Detention Station. And the people that were in Tuna Canyon Detention Station were folks who were picked up as a result of the December 7th presidential proclamations and 27. Those of Japanese, German, and Italian descent. Those were exclusively the people that were taken to Tuna Canyon. So I think that Tuna Canyon stands as an exception to so many of the internment camps now in the United States, who mostly were comprised of people who were picked up as a result of Executive Order 9066 in February 41. Oh, and thanks for putting this up. This is, my father had asked to speak with my mother at Terminal Island, and it was denied. He was not allowed to phone her. So his next stop was Tuna Canyon. And he wrote to my mom on the day that he arrived at Tuna Canyon from Terminal Island, and it was in May of 1942. And he said, I'm allowed to receive letters at the following address. So Tuna Canyon was located in the Sunland Tujunga area, which at the time was way, way far away from everybody. And the Tuna Canyon experience, curiously, and I've had the opportunity to compare notes with our Tuna Canyon group, apparently was a rather friendly atmosphere comparatively. the Merrill Scott, who was the overseer, was very sympathetic and very kind to all of the detainees there. And over 2,000 passed through in the years that Tuna Canyon was in operation. And my dad was one of them. From Tuna Canyon, he had a hearing. Actually, he had a hearing, I believe, in Terminal Island. His hearing was the hearings that they had for the prisoners was to decide whether they were to be released, paroled, detained, or repatriated, meaning they were going to send him back to the country of origin. So it was decided that my father's case, considering his relationship with a German company over so many years, was to be further investigated. So from Tuna Canyon, he was sent to Stringtown, Oklahoma, and he really wasn't there very long, but it also was not a pleasant place. It was in the middle of the desert. It seemed like to him a desert in Oklahoma, and of course the winds and the tornadoes and so on and so forth. But I think maybe, and the illustration is that internees of war, and I have hundreds of these letters from my parents, that they were required to write on the appropriate stationery that would be censored, and it would have to be in English, of course. And so my dad spent some time in Oklahoma, and then it was decided that he would have another hearing. He was sent back to Tuna Canyon, and his final hearing allowed for him to be released and paroled. And this was Stringtown. I actually, Carrie, I really didn't see that picture up close until you sent it to me. Thank you so much. I should have looked at it. But I had this image of Stringtown in my mind from my father's. He was a scribe. He loved writing. And so he was the editor of the newspaper for the prisoners. So that's the only experience I had with Stringtown. But thanks so much for putting the picture up. I appreciate that. So he was sent back to Tuna Canyon, where he had his final hearing. And these were his alien registration papers. And as you can see, he had lost quite a bit of weight. From what I understand from his letters after reading them, and my mother's letters, he was not in good health, starting in Bogar. I think the problem started at Bogar, and he was not in particularly good health during his incarceration. But he was released. And this is another example of how our American friends stepped up to the plate. His parole officer were a couple that we'd known a very long time. So every month or 6 weeks, they lived in our old neighborhood, and we would go, and his wife, their names were Charles and Vera Horn, and his wife would fix us the most magnificent meal, and we'd all sit around the dinner table and enjoy a glass of wine. And I just thought we were there for a friendly visit, but apparently this visit was mandated by the federal government, and the Horns had been my father's friends for years. So this is another example of the generosity and the understanding and the acceptance and the belief that these people had in my father and in our family. And
this goes back a little bit to before your father was out, right?
It does go back, but to conclude my dad's story, and this is more my mother's story and mine, my dad was released from parole on the day the war ended, the Pacific Theater War, and he was no longer obligated. However, as you could imagine, things were not easy. Being once again in the mainstream, and think about, I've thought about so often how Americans must have felt having been involved in yet another foreign war and having their husbands and their brothers and their fathers sent overseas, and some didn't come home and sacrificed their lives. I can't imagine how they must have felt. And when they see someone who has a very strong German accent, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy on them, and it was not easy on my parents. And of course, now that I've been more or less invited into the Japanese American community, for which I'm extremely grateful, I've heard so many stories of the difficulties that the Japanese Americans had trying to return home to their homes. And the thing that we do have in common was that all of our businesses were confiscated. My parents had to sell their house in order to live after everything was confiscated except the house that we lived in. And when my father was released, we sold our house and lived in a very small apartment, which wasn't the easiest thing, as I remember. And finally, my parents bought a small house in a neighborhood that was way far away from where we had been before. And my father had a job, but it was hard to get a job. No one wanted to hire a German who, after this terrible struggle of 5 years. And so my dad decided to try and start up a business that was the same as he had before, an importing business. And over the years, he invited my mother to join him in his business. And the two of them worked together, he with his steel products, and my mother imported Steiff animals, which was a German manufacturer, and they still exist today. A very nice high-end toy. And fortunately, in the atmosphere of everyone wanting to start up again, and everyone was ready to go back into business after these long years of war, that my father and my mother in their business also enjoyed, once again, prosperity. And it did have a happy ending. It did indeed. However,
Whoops. Sorry, technical error. There we go.
That's okay. So Carrie and I spoke about what life was like on the outside. And I think that when I think of life on the outside, many of the families, including the Japanese, Italian, and German families of descent, some of them moved to the camps with their husbands because they had no means of support. My mother didn't have any means of support either. She tried to get a job, but it didn't last very long. She had a very heavy German accent, and this was while the war was still raging. And so food was scarce and life wasn't easy for she or I. And she was actually the strength behind my dad, believe it or not. She was the one that organized everything for his hearings. She was the central focal point for our American friends who wrote letters of substantiation and recommendation and support for my dad all along, from North Africa to the United States of America. But she coordinated all of this. But having a child, trying to get her husband back, was very difficult. She had a delicate emotional health anyway. And I'm impacted less by my own experience as a child as I am my mother's. And my mother was spat upon in public transportation, and to see that was extremely painful for me, especially as a small child. And I really didn't quite understand what that was all about. And I'm sure that the persons that did it had a reason for doing it other than just that. I could imagine they too had a backstory. And however, those are gestures that stay with one for the rest of one's life. And you'd asked Carrie about what
you told me an amazing story, a school story about a coat. Do you want to tell that?
Word. I do. You know, at school, I was just like the rest of the kids, you know. I mean, it's, you know, Hitler in the trash can and Roosevelt on top. And, you know, we were right there in the war effort. But some of the kids took advantage. They had heard, or maybe heard my mother speak. I have no idea. This is not in my memory base. But they called Nazis, Germans were known as Nazi Germans at the time. It was all one word during the war, Nazi German. So apparently some of the kids, the older ones actually, not kids in my class, heard that I was German, of German descent, and they called me Nazi. And of course, I was like clueless, like, what's a Nazi? You know, I mean, I can't even spell Nazi. What's Nazi? And I knew it wasn't a very good thing. I knew that. This was in first grade or second grade, something like that. And I knew it wasn't a very good thing. And there was another incident that I remember that a couple of girls always used to say, you know, we're going to take you to Sister Patricia. I went to a Roman Catholic school. If you don't give us your lunch money, of which there wasn't very much of, that we're going to turn you into Sister Patricia. And of course, I was terrorized, and I told my mom about it. And I said, Mama, they're going to turn me into Sister Patricia like a bad girl. I must have done something wrong. And my mother said, oh, I'm so sorry. And she didn't really know what to say. But when I came back with that story a couple of times, my mama said, you know, straighten up your back. And the next time they come up to you, just say, okay, let's go. And I headed right in the direction of the principal's office. And when I got there, they were gone. Where they went, I have no idea. But they didn't take me to Sister Patricia's office. So I went, well, there's nobody there, so I guess I'll go. And the other story was the coat story. And this was a friend that was, I think, a year or two older than I. And her mama used to leave her after school like my mother did sometimes. And my mother came to pick me up, and she was asked to go into the principal's office. And I was asked to sit outside. And so was this girl. We were sitting outside the principal's office, outside. The principal's office was inside, and we were sitting on a bench outside. And I heard voices being raised inside, and I thought, my gosh, what is this about? So I was asked to come in, and I was told that I had been accused of stealing this young lady's coat and hiding it, or taking it home, and wanting it for myself and stealing it. And I said, well, I didn't do that. I have no idea what coat she had. I have no idea. And so the principal, I said, really, I didn't do it. And I was crying, and my mother was upset. And it took, you know, my mother was a relatively shy individual, so that she did all of the things she did for my dad during the war still astounds me. And the fact that she stood up to the principal astounds me. And so I said, I didn't do it. And I was crying. I've never. And so they invited this other person, her name was Judy, to come in. And the principal confronted her. And of course, she could see my mother and she could see that I was upset. And she started to cry. And she finally admitted that she had taken the coat and she'd hidden it in the gravel in the back of the school because she'd gotten her coat with spots from lunch hour. And she was afraid she was going to get in trouble. And she figured, you know, maybe I might have figured it was perfect reason. So I do remember that. But the rest, not so much.
Wow.
It just I felt like a regular kid for the most part, and that war was always an override. But I was told by my parents, which is never, ever to tell anyone what happened to us during the war. And of course, I didn't ask because it was a very sensitive subject. And Carrie, when we talked, she said, I should tell you about the chicken house. The only reason I found out about my folks is when we moved to the new place, which was kind of ratty, but the people that had been there before had this chicken house. There weren't any chickens in there anymore, but my parents put all their papers from this period of time, which I now have, in the chicken house. So one fine day, there was nothing going on and I was bored. So I decided to hit the chicken house and find out what was in there. And that is the only reason I found out what actually happened to my parents. And I didn't find out the complete story until I did my dissertation on the topic. I went through all my parents' papers. I went to, there's a dearth of information about German American phenomenon because no one knows about it. But I was fortunate enough to go down to JANM, the Japanese American National Museum. They have a marvelous library and research library of Japanese American experience. Simone Wiesenthal. Also, there's a lot of information on Holocaust survivors' children, which was the topic of my dissertation because I was curious. I wanted to find out if there were any folks out there just like me. And of course, the Holocaust situation, those were death camps. That's no comparison. But the effect on the children, whether it's the children of Japanese descent or of Jewish descent whose parents were Holocaust survivors or Holocaust victims, we all felt kind of the same. We walked very delicately around those subjects, and we knew that it was not a good thing, a terrible thing, especially, you know, in the death camps. But here it was also a matter of shame and shame, mostly shame. And it was years before I could speak up about that. And basically it was due to my dissertation, my question. And that's how I became better acquainted with what happened.
Wow. And so while your parents were still alive, you never had a conversation with them about it?
Very rarely. My mother
Wow.
was the one that talked mostly. My father was a very proud and educated man, and this was really hard on him. And it's only over the years that I realized how hard it was. He was also a strong man. My mother was emotionally not as strong as he, and she suffered a great deal. And of course, I'm a girl, so I relate very much to my mother's suffering and how she must have felt not having a husband, not having income, having to care for a child. And I often think that it might have been better for her, and I don't know about me, if we had gone to the camps, as many of the German American women did, and many, of course, the Japanese American women did as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know. Those are all. It's like a slight. It's like it's all a matter of perspective. What it would have been like, I don't know, but that's how it was like for us. Life on the outside wasn't a picnic. I remember that. Definitely not.
What an amazing story. And interesting to think about you discovering this as, I don't know, when you first discovered the chicken house, how old were you? 12, 13?
Yeah,
13,
12 or 13,
wow.
right about the age of reason when you want to know.
Wow. So many important stories, and I'm so thankful that you're sharing yours with us. I wanted to ask our audience if anyone wanted, if they have a question, if they want to type it into the comment section, we'll be thrilled to put it up here. And while we're waiting for that, the whole idea of a child's experience of war is such an important one. And of course, it's still going on today, and children are still being detained and being the victims of violence. So it's just a lot of food for thought, isn't it, Sigrid?
It is. It is. And that's, one of the reasons that I chose to speak out when I did. And if anything, I'm hopeful that it's a cautionary tale. And that's one reason that I'm most grateful to the Tuna Canyon Coalition, who have taken me in and allowed me to tell my story and to share their stories with them. And the mission of Tuna Canyon, again, which housed those folks who were detained as a result of the presidential proclamations after December 7th, where I'm allowed to share in their stories. And the mission of the Tuna Canyon Coalition is, in fact, to create a memorial on the site in Sunland, Tujunga, where the camp once existed. It morphed eventually into a golf course, which is now closed. But there are hopes that a memorial site and possibly a park or something larger, but still, it's still in progress. It isn't even baked, not even. Still, the ingredients are still being mixed. But to create a memorial park where the camp once stood, as more than anything, Carrie and everybody out there, a cautionary tale. If there's anything I can leave everybody with, is a cautionary tale, because history, the human memory is so short that it happens again and again. It's happening today.
Yes, it is. I've shared the website here for Tuna Canyon, and there is an amazing amount of information on it. So I do absolutely invite the public to explore that. And I want to also tell everybody that Dr. Russell Endo will be our next speaker on this series, and I believe it's Saturday, June 16th, that he will be speaking. And he has a great deal of information about the laws behind all these camps and the extent of them, and as well as having firsthand information about his own father's incarceration, as you do, Sigrid.
His grandfather was also at Tuna Canyon, but he has all of the historical details. But I think one historical detail that I would like to share with you, and I forgot, is one of the most important ones, and that everything that was done then was legal as a result of the Enemy Alien Act of 1798. That's what's left of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so that Alien Act is still in effect today, that was penned in 1798 and allows for persons whose nations are hostile, not even at war, are hostile, seem hostile to the United States, to be detained. So this is something that is kind of brewing around now in Congress, in the House. So that law is, I think, needs to be more closely examined.
Great. And I do hope that Dr. Enda will have more information for us on that too. Well, I think we've reached the end of our hour, and I've so enjoyed listening to your story, Sigrid. And
Thank you.
I hope that the rest of you join us for our next few talks. And I hope you also get a chance to read the book that our Book to Action program is based around. It's called They Called Us Enemy by George Takei. So anyway, Dr. Toye, thank you.
Thank you for allowing me to be here. I appreciate it. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.